Good afternoon, everybody. I am Harlan Levine. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of the City of Hope Medical Foundation, and I'm very pleased to be here for this session on the NIH. Very timely, of course, given the budget cuts that are being proposed. As City of Hope, as a researcher who, along our history, have discovered synthetic insulin and pathways for monoclonal antibodies, and along with many other institutions are actively working today on immunotherapy, CAR T cells, precision medicine, we've really come to value the partnership and the funding from the NIH. And here to talk about the history of the NIH and also the future, we have two directors, former directors of the NIH, Dr. Klausner and Dr. von Eschenbach. And to introduce them, I want to turn things over to Jonathan LaPook, who is the Chief Medical Correspondent for CBS nationally, and also professor at NYU, and also the Executive Director of the Empathy Project at NYU. Jonathan?
And I always bail on these introductions by having everybody introduce themselves. Rick, why don't we start with you?
So I was the director, we were directors of the National Cancer Institute, which is different and better.
So it's like Tony Fauci has been made the head of the NIH more times
so many times on
television.
So many times. And, you know.
I think I did it once.
To the chagrin of the NIH director. I was appointed by Bill Clinton, and then one of the few people from that administration to be reappointed by George Bush. And left at the end of 2001 after 7 years before going on to help launch the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. I ran their global health program and a variety of other things since then.
Andy?
I'm a urologic oncologist by training. I spent my career at MD Anderson Cancer Center, and then I came to Washington to succeed Rick at the National Cancer Institute. And I served there from 2002 to 2006, when I then moved over to become Commissioner of the Food and Drug Administration.
And we were talking beforehand about how to frame all of this and where to start. So we're going to assume you know nothing about the National Cancer Institute and start with a little bit of a history lesson, but not too long, don't glaze over. Rick, there was already a debate where we start, so where should we start?
Well, the NCI was created by an act of Congress in 1937. And the reason I said this was such an important event, it really was the first example of the federal government in the United States going beyond infectious disease, beyond things related to the military, responding to a phenomenon that was new, which was of advocacy, that for years had been looking for the government to do something about cancer. You have to understand, NCI and the NIH is a research institution, it supports research. But at that time, research was virtually all financed privately. In fact, to be a researcher, you generally had to have your own money. And the whole phenomenon of government-funded granting was very controversial. And the NCI Act, the National Cancer Act in 1937, was a breakthrough. It created this idea that was still being argued about, is it the proper role of government to do this sort of thing? What actually happened so supposedly, it's still being debated, as we heard with the budget cut, what is the proper role of government? And it's worth just talking about, because this is in this framework of what these institutions are. And it was the end of World War II. World War II, it was seen that this was an extraordinary example of government-funded research that created radar and just all sorts of things. And most importantly, antibiotics and new ways of treating shock and things like that. And at the end of his term and near the end of his life, Roosevelt wrote a letter which said, we knew this war was coming to an end, but we know if you compare the First World War to the Second World War, the differences were all due to science. And he talked about how many lives were saved. So we actually engaged science in a war. And he said, now it's time, as we think about beyond the war, to engage in a war on disease. I've looked for years, was that the first time anyone used that metaphor, war on cancer, war on disease? And I can't find anyone else that did it. And he asked Vannevar Bush, who had run the Office of Scientific Research for the government in the Second World War, to produce a document to explain and justify why it was the rightful role of the federal government to turn its attention, not in wartime, not science and engineering in the service of our military, but in the service of improving life. And just to end this, Vannevar Bush came back with a very brief report called Science, the Endless Frontier, where he articulated philosophically that the role of the government was always to explore and protect boundaries, exploration, our borders. But as you go forward, what are our borders in the world that Vannevar Bush saw? And it was the borders defined by knowledge and science. And so that's why he said, Science, the Endless Frontier, and in that framed the whole framework for society through its government to fund basic research, which was what this is all about, in the service of a war on disease. And that's why I think the 1937 Act conceptually was more important than the act he likes, which was the 1971 War on Cancer Act.
Well, that's a tough act to follow. So why don't you talk about your act that you think is important?
Yeah. Well, what Rick has described is we began a trajectory back in 1937. And in 1944, the NIH came along, and now we had this constellation that, as he says, was funding science for the benefit of humanity and humankind. But what happened in 1971 was the nation was overwhelmed by this threat, this existential threat that cancer was creating. It was affecting almost every family in the United States. It was virtually a death sentence. And that science that had been funded in 1937 was beginning to start to create this momentum and this trajectory where we could begin to see that we could develop ways of coping with a societal problem like cancer. So in 1971, the nation again came together and galvanized around this idea that we could not just fund research, but we could apply research. And so they passed the National Cancer Act of 1971, which gave the NCI a series of very unique authorities or authorizations. In other words, it wasn't just so much how much we were going to fund, it was how we were going to spend it. And so that bill contained a number of very critically important changes that separated the NCI from the rest of NIH. It gave the NCI, first and foremost, the power to not just use the traditional grant mechanism for funding research, but to use a contract mechanism, which essentially the difference there is the grant mechanism says, give us your greatest ideas, and if your peers agree, we'll fund those. The contract medicine says, this is what we want you to address. You give us the best ideas how you could do that, and if your peers agree, we'll fund that. That led to the development of programs. It led to the development of cancer centers, for example. At the time, there were only 3. There were soon 20, and now today we have 69. And those cancer centers, like City Hope, MD Anderson, Dana-Farber, Sloan Kettering, et cetera, have been the engines of innovation and creativity, taking research and applying it to a problem of society, cancer, and basically creating a revolution in our understanding of how to deal with life science in general and disease in general. So NCI became, if you will, the vanguard. It became, if you will, the paradigm for what we're seeing today as how we can attack the problems that plague society. So they were both important, and they were building on each other, and now we're looking at the next iteration.
All right, so that's it for the history lesson, I promise, but that's really interesting, and I always like to assume that people know nothing at all about the subject to begin, and I think that's a really important place to start. Next, I want to move, if I'm here eating lunch and watching a lecture, I'm going to want to know, how does this relate to me and to my loved ones? And as we all know, we're getting older as a population, and I believe cancer as a cause of death has just surpassed cardiovascular disease, or is about the same. It's going to certainly as time goes on, because we actually have made great inroads into cardiovascular disease. So first, to start off with, because I'd love to give everybody some insider look to things like that they might not have known about, or they couldn't read about easily. I think one of the coolest things that I have ever observed is Building 10. So show of hands, how many people here know what Building 10 is at the NCI? 3 people, two of them on the stage. So tell us about Building 10, because it's truly a remarkable and I believe unique place.
Well, Building 10, if I may say, was built, it's called the Clinical Center at the NIH, and it was built as really the first and maybe the only hospital in the world that is all about the immediate experimental translation of discoveries in the laboratory which were surrounding the clinic. So this was not a separate hospital. My first laboratory was about 10 yards away from one of the wards. And it was built to create this really quite novel, complete intermingling of patient care, research.
You can leave it.
I can leave it?
Yep.
Oh.
Yeah, we're good. Just hold.
I'm just worried other things will start falling off.
You've just thrown the Earth's orbit off
Yeah,
about a
okay.
tenth of an angstrom, but it's okay.
And so that's what Building 10 is. And extraordinary things happen there.
Bench
in
to
Building
bed.
10.
Bench to bed.
Bench to bed. And this is now talked about all over the place. And let me just say, it gets back to something Andy said. What's very interesting about what NCI has done, it's not only funded research, but it's created institutions and models to create the ecosystem, the infrastructure that allows research, the clinic, the community, population, to actually enter a process of learning and application, So, NCI went forward and developed national clinical trials networks that didn't exist because there was no industry making cancer drugs 50 years ago. In fact, no one thought there was any money to be made in cancer drugs. So NCI, in essence, created cancer drug development and an infrastructure for clinical trials that was responsible, for example, for the cure of pediatric leukemia, interestingly, that happened over about 20 years without any major scientific breakthrough. It just was
Incremental.
It's incremental by putting the care of children with cancer into an NCI-funded national network of continuous learning. So, and that was very important that happened with the cancer, creating the ecosystem.
So when we think about doing funding cuts, you're cutting off a line that goes back decades and decades and decades, so that when you then have an epiphany years later, perhaps something's personally affecting you now and you're in government, it's too late. It doesn't matter how rich you are. You can't suddenly come up with a cure. And that's, it seems intuitively obvious, but when you look at the proposals about funding cut, it has to jump into your head, what are you talking about?
Well, let me go back to the question you asked for those here and those at home. What does this mean to you? Why was this important? What did we get out of this? And most of you have heard about the frustration that in 1971 we declared a war on cancer, and we don't seem to have won the war. But what has happened is we've learned how to win the war. And let me explain why that's true. what occurred over these past years, what the NCI drove and was responsible for, was we stopped seeing cancer as an event in someone's life and began to understand it as a mechanism, as a process, and began to unravel the secrets of the mechanisms that are underpinning that process, the genetic, the molecular, the cellular mechanisms that are involved in why we're susceptible to cancer in terms of genetic defects that we may have, how cancers develop and evolve, how they begin to spread and metastasize. And so as we began to understand those mechanisms, we began to intuitively and rationally figure out how to intervene in that mechanism to alter or change that process. That now is leading to an era where we have almost remarkable and miraculous ways of being able to cope with not all cancers, but certainly with many of them. But even more importantly, it's taught us how we should be approaching every other disease, Alzheimer's, diabetes, cardiac disease, et cetera. So we're talking about the NCI because what the American people have made possible for us and for the world is now transforming all disease.
So, and I know it's the NCI, but we're talking about, you can't talk about the NCI without talking about cancer. So again, the journalist in me wants to make sure that everybody understands what Andy was referring to. As an example, when I was in medical school, which was many years ago, 76 to 80, cancer was categorized by the organ that it was in. Breast cancer, colon cancer, pancreas cancer, right? And you treated breast cancer with these drugs and colon cancer with that drug. Now, through research largely done in the NCI and also done elsewhere, we're thinking about it totally differently. We're thinking about, well, we know there's a genetic defect, there's a mutation, there's a protein issue, which is leading to the cancer or has happened in the cancer, and that defect happens in colon cancer, but it also, that same one happens in bladder cancer. So we're going to have a drug that addresses that defect, and by the way, we can apply it to the bladder cancer. And who that's really benefiting are the people with the orphan cancers, the people who, they're so small in numbers that companies don't want to spend a lot of money. They parenthetically get treated also. That is a huge difference. It's a complete paradigm shift. Another shift you've heard about is about immunotherapy. And we did, if you Google, you can find it. But several months ago, we did a 90-minute special on CBS Sunday Morning about cancer that I anchored, which was the first time we'd ever done that. And I remember Rand Morrison, who's the executive producer, saying, you know, it's Sunday morning, we're talking about cancer for 90 minutes, but it's the right thing to do. And I did a piece about Steve Rosenberg, about immunotherapy, and we featured Steve Rosenberg, who's the head of surgery at the National Institutes of Health. And so just a little picture here of what I saw to give you a sense of what really goes on in Building 10. First of all, you go up there. To get into Building 10 is impossible, you know, after the strip search and everything. There's no strip search, but it's really felt like that. So, yeah, a lot of security. And then you get up there, and the first thing you notice is you walk down the hallways, and you see pictures from decades ago of fellows and attendings and professors and researchers, and you look into the rooms, and everybody is hard at work, dozens of people who you will never know their names. And these people, all they want is to be able to be funded to go to work for, I asked Steve what their salary was, for too little money. And there was a documentary that Discovery Channel, I think it's going to air over the summer, in August maybe, called First in Human. And what they did is, remarkably, nobody's ever done this before, they embedded 3 cameras for a year in Building 10. And they followed several patients. One who had leukemia, a girl with leukemia, a guy with a sarcoma, somebody with sickle cell, and they just saw, you know, what happened over the year. And you cannot believe the attention that happens in those, inside that building. So you get a little bit of a glimpse of what goes on there. And then Steve Rosenberg has been there for 40 years or so, and I think he added up the number of times that he's that he's had a day off. Very few. When I moderated the premiere of First in Human in Washington about a month ago, it was the day that Congress had said, remember there was going to be a large cut in the NIH budget. And in fact, Congress came back and says, no, I think we'll give you another $2 billion for this year. Of course, it's still up for debate for the future. And when that was announced, everybody, it happened to be that day and it was mentioned, and everybody in the audience, a lot of them were researchers, stood up and cheered as though Oprah had just said, you get a car, and you get a car, and you get a car. And I couldn't help but thinking, and I said, you are so excited about being told that you are going to be allowed to work 16 hours a day for too little money. So in all of this discussion of the National Cancer Institute and about cancer research, I just want to give you a little amuse-bouche, a little glimpse into what's going on behind those walls, the people you will never hear about who are doing unbelievable work. So,
yeah, and as Andy said, there is a feeling that it's beginning to pay off, and it's been too slow for everyone. And this whole idea of the war on cancer, I just have to tell you what it feels like when you feel like you're responsible for that. I once got on a flight from Boston to Washington when I was NCI director, and the USA Today, which everyone had and was reading, big block letters, 30-year war on cancer, a failure. And I was late, so I had to walk through the whole plane to get to the back, and all I see is that, and first of all, what I knew is that by the time I reached Washington, a Senate hearing was going to be called, and I'd be called in and said, why did you fail? Which was true, and I got there, it was already set up. But the reality is, it is quite extraordinary how different it is now than just 20 years ago. And you can trace these things to this. It just takes time for basic research to find its way into the clinic. And immunotherapy is just a great example.
And I forgot to tell you, and I wanted to tell you just quickly what immunotherapy is. And here's the analogy, because you heard about CAR-T, C-A-R-T therapy. It's basically, one of the things that cancer does is it cloaks itself from the immune system. It's like if you're a Star Trek fan or a Harry Potter, it makes itself invisible and the immune system can't find it. So what this does is you take out somebody's immune cells, you, in the lab, give it the scent of the cancer, like you would give the scent of somebody to a bloodhound. And you multiply the cells up, you put them back in, and it goes in and can find, strip out the cloak of invisibility, and attack, and often destroy the cancer. And in the case of a little girl who we followed for this piece, you could find it online, she had a kind of childhood leukemia that's 95% or even more curable. She was one of the lucky few who it didn't work for, the standard therapy, and she was out of luck, and she got this therapy, and she got cured. And when you think about, statistics and failure, and we're not doing as well as we should, still tell that to the parents of this little girl
But let's talk about Building 10 in that story, because I can bring some personal story. So I was a researcher in the NCI. No one there ever asked me to justify what I was working on, and I was trying to figure out in 1983 how immune cells were activated. And I discovered, when I was still in the lab myself, this gene, which is the gene that has all the information to turn on T cells, the zeta chain. And in fact, I made, in 1984, the first chimeric antigen, and then sent those clones out to people. Carl June and those people were in my laboratory.
Google Carl June. You'll see some good stories.
He was in my lab, and now, but I had no idea. I was not working on it to cure cancer. I was in the Cancer Institute, but no one ever asked me. But that's how research happens. 1984, I can still picture the gel when I realized there's this thing there, and that gene is now exactly that scent of the cancer, and it's extraordinary what's going on with that, and we're going to move from leukemias and lymphomas to solid tumors. But that's what NCI means. It means that we have this faith in the power of research and science. The threats to NCI, honestly, to me, are not, is this year's budget going to be down or up? It's going to be whether we as a society value science, value the values of science, which is truth and fact and not fact. It's a moral issue for us. It's not just a fiscal issue. And my anxiety about NCI and NIH, I don't know, you didn't ask me my anxiety, but I'll tell you, goes back to this question of the fundamental view of science, of individual exploration, of the freedom of people to create facts and to act on them, and whether that enterprise is what we applaud, what we, or not. Are we skeptical of science?
Andy?
So let's follow up on that from the point of view that the National Cancer Institute, throughout the history we've been talking about, has been the largest, greatest, most funded institute within NIH.
Yeah.
NCI gets more money. And you rightfully should ask, what are we getting for it? What's the return on that investment?
What do they get a year, just for people to
About
know?
$5
billion.
5 or 6 billion.
$5
something
billion.
like that.
One of the things that this study of the most egregious disorder of life, this disorder of growth and differentiation that we call cancer, has led us to understand the mysteries of normal cell growth and differentiation. And so one of the most exciting frontiers in science and in medicine now is stem cell biology and regenerative medicine. The idea that we not only can eradicate disease, but we're going to be able to start to restore health. We're going to be able to take patients who have kidney failure and maybe at some point help to regenerate enough of that kidney function that they don't need a transplant or don't need dialysis, with huge implications as far as quality of life and the cost of healthcare. That's all a return on the investment that's come from the cancer enterprise. So as Rick's saying, why should we protect this? Why should we continue to drive this inquisitiveness of science to understand these fundamental processes? Because the payoffs are multiplied and are unbelievable in what is within our grasp.
I'd love to bring people inside and have you confide in, say, the most difficult moment of your tenureship, if you think one that might give some insight into things that people just simply don't realize.
I'm happy to give mine.
Yeah.
I'll give one, yeah.
My most difficult moment of running the NCI was the mammography wars and the mammography debates. When we were being asked to develop recommendations for what age women should start getting mammograms. And the emotions around that from all sides. The most emotional were not the breast cancer advocates or women, they were radiologists. They were the most emotional. Of course, Congress gets involved, which does not make it easy. I was called one night by the head of the Appropriation Committee at the time, which is very powerful, saying, if you don't recommend that women start getting mammograms at the age of 40, you will not get a budget. Wow. Furthermore, if you don't do it, you're going to lose your job. And so I actually called the Secretary of HHS, and she laughed. She was very supportive. But it was really, really difficult. The emotions around, because it's one of the things about science as it relates to medicine, why it's so difficult, science is not intuitive. It's often counterintuitive. It was obvious that mammography saved lives. Obvious. But the data actually wasn't all that clear. But the pressures were enormous. And it was a very difficult time. That was my low point.
By the way, in the middle of I did so many stories on this, and one of them was I reached this poor woman who was on the United States Preventive Services Task Force after a particularly controversial recommendation, and I found her She was literally hiding in the woods afterwards. She was in the woods. She said, I'm not going to tell you where I am, but I'm out of town at an undisclosed spot. So,
You know, he wasn't kidding. One of the other distinctions about being the NCI director is that we're presidential appointees, unlike the other institute directors except for the NIH director. So we can get fired. My most difficult challenge, I think, as director was to realize that I was a portfolio manager. There were $5 billion, but they were allocated across portfolios that looked like basic research or discovery research, clinical research, translational research. And the struggles of the balances and the allocations were extremely difficult because it was a zero-sum game. And for me, there was the need to protect the R01 grants, those basic science, come up with a great, insightful idea. But on the other hand, I had to fund programs that I knew were going to create infrastructure, that were going to enable all of our pursuits. So for example, putting $160 million into a nanotechnology initiative for cancer that would nurture the ability to bring that new discipline into the cancer agenda. To be able to fund the Cancer Genome Atlas so that we'd be able to create an infrastructure to understand across multiple tumors. So I think for the NCI director, it's that tension, and no matter where you put the money, someone is going to be unhappy, and you've got to deal with that.
Rick touched on this. Neither of you can be fired now from the NCI, so I do want to wade into this. I did a number of interviews during the March for Science, and one recurring theme was, what's going to happen to our blossoming scientists? Because, and I got example after example of people, one woman who was a scientist in Germany, that's not one of the countries that's on the list, but she, brilliant woman, is decided not to come here because she just didn't know what was going to happen. And of course, China is investing, other countries are investing. Are we in danger of giving up our leadership?
Yes.
Yes.
Can you talk about that?
Absolutely. You know, I mean, and it is extraordinary. I mean, you know, there's lots of ways to think about how exceptional the United States is, but the extent to which the United States has led this, you know, half-century-long revolution in science-based medicine is extraordinary, and it's new. A lot of it is because Europe was destroyed. Europe was really the center of science-based medicine until the Second World War. Europe was destroyed, but the United States came in, and it did two things, were remarkable. Again, largely at the NIH. It made the decision, one, to create this whole enterprise that we've talked about, but something we haven't mentioned is creating an international training program. People came from all over the world to NIH and created affinities and fondness for America, an understanding of those values of free expression and science, which was always threatening to various regimes. And it's amazing what those relationships have spawned. And so there is very little question that there's an anxiety, I travel around the world a lot, that whether people want to come to America, whether they're welcomed, what will happen to them. There's all sorts of things. We are right now not currently viewed as this shining place on the hill that people are sure they want to come to. This is a tragic loss for the world and for the US. So I'm very worried about that.
No, I think there's significant issues that we have to face, and they're really ecosystem issues. I would say that when one looks at the funding questions that are being raised, there's two parts to that. One is the fact that we need to spend more, but there's also the other side of the equation that we need to spend better. And when you look at what's occurred in some of the tension within Congress, and especially around the 21st Century Cures Act, there was this tension about allocation of more money, which is important and necessary, but we need to be responsible about how we're spending that money and looking critically about the ways in which we could more appropriately invest those dollars. And so we've got to work both sides of that equation. It's important to recognize that although we're talking about NCI and NIH as if they're Washington, Bethesda-based entities, the fact of the matter is that the overwhelming majority of the money is distributed throughout the entire country. So it's nurturing an entire national enterprise. It's the seed money for lots of our universities and institutions that then catalyze the intellectual fermentation that's going on there. That's an area that needs to be looked at. One of the problems with the current proposed Trump budget is to kind of deal with this question of indirect cost. Now that's a little arcane for many people in the audience, but it's a critically important question about how do we fund the creative ideas that are being investigated, and how do we fund the infrastructure that supports the ability for those researchers to have a laboratory with lights on, et cetera. Right now, that needs significant attention. So we've got some issues.
Andy's making a fantastic point. Another interesting and difficult thing of being NCI director is this endless argument for more money. And it's very hard to even have a discussion with any groups about how well are we spending money. Let me tell an anecdote about that. So when I became director, I actually was the first time at NIH that we started inviting in advocates. Remember, I made a new advisory board for consumers. And I met in the first year of being NCI director with every cancer advocacy group that I could find. And then we had a meeting at the end of that year. I think I've told you about this. We brought everyone together, and I told them, I started by saying, I want to feedback what I've learned from you, what I've heard from you, and I have to say, I'm really disappointed. All any of you ever asked me was how much we're spending on this cancer, that cancer. You never asked me about how much progress we're making. Right. And they had been told by everyone it was all about money, and that's not true. But this is one of the most difficult things. The advocacy structure for everyone is money. And it makes it very hard, and I think it is one of the, what Andy said, underneath the chronically most difficult thing about being NCI director was the difficulty of that conversation. And look, the reality is when you spend money, you create entitlement groups, and it is really true. And it's very difficult to turn those things off. We don't have a good way to have those conversations. Right. And I think we need it.
And I have to say, going forward, since I just wanted to give little sprinkles for those who don't know it, when you think about spending better, you've heard about precision medicine, personalized medicine. There is a big initiative that's going to happen over many years to get 1 million Americans and get their genetic code decoded and then follow them for decades, see what happens to them, and being able to then look at somebody's genome and then direct some of their wellness efforts on that. Maybe we can prevent cancer in people who are at higher risk. So we tend to, that is a big frontier. You know, we tend to say, okay, we're looking for detected, and now how can we beautifully treat it? But there's a whole other approach, which is how do we prevent people from getting cancer in the first place? We have 18 minutes left. I want to turn this over to the audience. Yes, do we have a mic that's going to come? So hold on one second, because I know this is being recorded, and we want to preserve your dulcet tones. There we go. And I'm going to let the mic runner, you pick, because you know as well as I do.
Is it on? Do I push the button?
Try.
It's on.
I don't think so.
No, I don't think so.
You wanted a hot mic?
I can talk really loud.
Well, we just want to record it. Yeah.
Rick, you
There we
put
go.
your finger
There you
on
go.
something really important. Mammography screening is a great example because we know we need high-value care, right? We want high-quality care. We want to target it to the right women, but we want to do it efficiently. So we know that there's too much mammography screening. that low-risk women don't need as much. High-risk women need more. But we really aren't moving forward in doing that because of the political issues that you brought up. For example, we have a study ongoing at UCSF where we're using clinical markers, genetic markers, and women's preferences to determine whether you should get more screening or less. But I'm wondering, in this political environment, will we be able to move forward in doing this type of study that could potentially reduce cost?
You know, Catherine, it's really an interesting question about screening and how counterintuitive screening is. Let me describe something that I think is really important as an emerging concept in cancer, which is really new. And that is, there may be a lot of cancer, early stage cancer, that we don't care about.
Turtles and rabbits.
Right.
They were described as.
Yes. And this is, now you have to understand, this is not in the way of thinking about cancer biologists. It's emerging. But when we were trained, there wasn't anything other than everything's bad and you're lucky when you discover it early. Mm-hmm. It may well be that a significant amount, possibly even the majority, no one should quote me on that because I don't know, no one knows, of really early stage breast cancer that's picked up mammography never had to be treated at all. And in fact, there is at least one study that shows that if you ask the question, what is the mortality rate among women who are never screened with mammography versus screened with mammography, it's higher if you're screened. Now, why would that be? Why would that be? Well, one possibility is that, let's say, a large fraction of these early little tumors that are being picked up by mammography were never going to hurt you. They're just going to go away. They're never going to go. But we treat all of them, and the treatments have some low risks. You then, in fact, by screening, are making it worse. You're treating things you don't need to treat. Andy can talk about this. This has been a huge issue for prostate cancer. Yeah. And so it's both about policy and politics, but it's also about a changing conceptualization of the science. And without a changing conceptualization of science, we can't have a rational argument about, is it okay to ignore cancer?
Yeah. You've raised an issue that's probably best discussed with a lot of liquid refreshment. Because there are complexities to it and nuances to it that are difficult to cope with. There is nothing inherently good or evil in screening. It's what you do afterwards which creates good or harm. That's right. And so we need the science to continue to mature the ability to make decisions once we recognize or suspect that there's a problem. Is it a good prostate cancer or a bad prostate cancer? That sort of thing. The other part of the equation that you have to keep in mind is particularly true of prostate is what's the alternative? Because if it means for me as a urologist to give up PSA and go back to my finger, the digital rectal examination, then that's too high a price to pay because men will die as a result of that. And we don't talk about pap smears, but we basically eradicated a disease by virtue of doing a pap smear that required minimal kinds of interventions to take care of early pre-neoplastic lesions that never got to be cancers. So there's a lot to this question and a lot to this discussion, and the answer will come from better science.
That's right.
Great presentation, thank you. I'm a psychologist from Columbus, Ohio, and I've had the opportunity to work with Mike Caligieri and his team.
Oh, sure.
And as you know, one of 11 comprehensive cancer centers. One of my questions is, and I like the talking point, don't spend more necessarily, but spend better. Talk about collaboration. How can the NCI make Moffitt talk to James, talk to MD Anderson, I know you need about 30 of me to make that happen, but seriously, I mean, if we just shared information and everything else, it'd be incredible.
Well, I have to tell you that when I was there, I called a command meeting of all of the heads of the cancer center directors to meet with me for one day and retreat. It was the first time that all of them had ever come together at one single time with the NCI director to talk about a strategic agenda going forward. So the first responsibility, I think, of NCI is to convene. It's not just to fund, but convene and bring that network together and find the opportunities for interoperability. There's no reason why we should have 69 NCI-designated cancer centers that don't create a whole in which the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. So I think that's the first thing. What would you add?
Well, I think it's about incentives. And one of the things that NCI is really good at is creating new ways of behaving out in the community through incentives. Now, of course, the only way you can create new incentives, especially if it's a flat budget, is you get into Andy's problem. Who are you going to take money away from to create a new incentive to get, so will you reward people to collaborate? I do think that the granting system as a whole largely is built around funding individual investigators to do projects. And that's not why people do science. People don't do science to do projects. They do science to solve problems. But honestly, we don't fund people to solve problems. This is a bugaboo of mine. How do we learn to engage people? And here's the problem with it. It's about the elasticity of the system. To solve problems takes more money, more time than to do a project, the next project. But if we have a limited budget and we care about how many grants we get, then what you do is you make each grant smaller and smaller and smaller, and we atomize the approach to science, which I don't think is very attractive to young people. Yeah. And this is part of Andy's tension about how you so I think we don't do enough to use these resources to engage people. And by the way, if you challenge people to solve problems, they collaborate. Because very few people ever think that they can solve problems without collaborating. You fund people to do a small project, the next step of this gene and the next step, that they don't need to collaborate.
He did something which I wish he'll talk about, which was really transformational and worked within the ecosystem, and that was the SPORE grants, the Specialized Programs of Research Excellence, which you should talk about it because
it's okay, I like hearing you talk about it.
Right? No, it's a phenomenal contribution that not only did the people who got the SPORE grants do amazing things, but the people who didn't get them but worked hard to prepare to get one did great things.
That's right, and it stimulated them to store.
And it was this
all
idea
about collaboration.
of bringing them collaborative.
Years ago, I interviewed a woman named Giusti, and she's this remarkable woman, comes from industry, and she raised a boatload of money for multiple myeloma research with one condition. Oh, I'm going to give you the money, but by the way, you got to talk to each other.
Right.
Period.
Yeah. And people
Lo and behold, they had never seen that many new drugs in such a short period of time. So it's just, make people's self-interest overlap with each other. Yes, we have 10 minutes left.
I'm Nadine. I'm a pediatrician, and I run the Center for Youth Wellness in San Francisco. And as we're learning more about the early life antecedents for life course health, I'm really interested in understanding the extent to which the NCI is looking at one question, epigenetic markers in addition to the genomic work that you're doing, and also some of the impacts of the early life antecedents to cancers. Because I think we know that early adversity is associated with increased risk of certain type of cancers, and whether, where that fits in your agenda.
Yeah, and by the way, the paradox is that there's almost no diseases that you're less at risk for if you're poor but one exception is certain forms of pediatric leukemia, where the more and more wealthy you are, the higher the risk is, and maybe a lack of exposure to antigens or something like that.
No, cancers that you're more at risk for.
Cancers that you're more at risk for. I'm sorry. But I don't know exactly now what programs NCI has. I know there's a lot of interest in epigenetics and the environment. And in fact, the genomics approach, let me just go back to it, I think is going to finally revolutionize epidemiology. It's been very hard to find causes of cancer, particularly exogenous causes, unless they're enormous, like smoking or sunlight. But the fact that things that cause cancer from the environment leave a signature in the nature of the mutations that you see in the cancer, spectacular work, mostly from the UK, I think it's going to allow us to really turn that around and use the genome to ask what's going on, whether it's in early development, exposures, the environment, et cetera.
And I just want to flag that I had said adversity, and I know you said poverty, but I want to just flag that adversity does happen in all socioeconomic strata, and that actually the seminal research was done in a middle-class population. So I want to make sure that when we're doing this research, when we look at the percentage of Americans that are in poverty, right, we're not talking about the 64% of Americans who have experienced significant adversity.
Right.
And because we know that's a risk factor, I think that's important.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's just one guiding principle that I think has always been present at the NCI, going back 100 years ago to a guy by the name of Paget that came up with the concept of the seed and the soil. It's not just the cancer cell, it's the soil it finds itself in. And that's got to do with the microenvironment, but it's also got to do with the macro environment. So it's a part of the philosophy of driving the portfolio.
And that's being used now, bisphosphonates, drugs like Fosamax, that change the bone so that maybe it's less fertile place for metastases to go, which is fascinating. We've got 5 minutes.
Lots of questions.
And lots of questions. So we'll leave it up to the mic runner.
My name is Sakith Guntapalli. I'm a surgical oncologist at the University of Colorado. And my question is, I specialize in gynecologic cancers. My question is with regards to funding. For many young investigators, they find many roadblocks and many hurdles to getting NIH, NCI funding. I know there are a lot of programs. I've been to the NCI, and I've been very impressed by the number of programs that are available. But the psyche for young investigators is, it's just not going to happen. And you get to this point where you start to think, well, you shouldn't even try. One thing that has kind of come up for young investigators is the idea of the investigator-initiated trial working with pharma. Do you see more of a collaboration between the National Cancer Institute and the NCI with pharma to fund these very big questions? Because we know that they tend to have the dollars to do it and tend in a lot of ways to be independent of budget cuts from the president or whatever party is in power. Where do you see that going forward, and do you see that as maybe a new avenue to explore?
I think I'll let you speak to it, but that's critically important. Look, let's be realistic. We're not going to double the NIH budget again. That is just not going to work politically or economically. So where's the money going to come from? Because we should double the investment. There has to be a collaborative relationship, not just with industry, but also with philanthropy. You mentioned the Myeloma Foundation, et cetera. So we need to be thinking of this in a much more holistic way of bringing assets together from multiple sources to create the kind of environment that's going to nurture the next generation of brilliance. So you said it well.
No, we'll get more questions.
You know what, I have to just say, so that I've said it, I thought several times today, pharma, that's a whole other, and the drug prices, and it's a whole other, I think, seminar. But I just want to at least note that it's a question that we haven't answered today, or a topic we haven't gone on. One more. I think we have time for one more. Who was a fake out, and then he turned to you.
I'm glad. Actually, I want to it's not so much a question, but an observation. I'm Linda Belkis. I'm the Deputy Director for the Comprehensive Cancer Center at the City of Hope. And I heard you, and I think part of what everybody hears, and they, there's war, and we always think there's an end to the war. I think the message we have to be sending very loud is that we have won so many great battles. We have done so many great childhood leukemia and so many other things. We have got miracles that are going on, and maybe we don't broadcast it enough. Maybe we have to show their return on investment better. So that's one observation. The other one is we kind of, I know when I was training in the last millennium, we were all looking for the magic bullet, right? Now you're all going, exactly, but they talk so much about like there was going to be one cure for cancer. And now we know it's such an incredibly complex and diverse disease, and that the person housing it, the host housing that disease, is contributing as much to the tumor as the tumor is to, and these are things we didn't even know that long ago. So we have won many great battles. And thank you all for doing that.
Okay. Thank you. We're out of time. I do want to give one. I was just told yesterday that they're going to rebroadcast this CBS Sunday morning 90-minute, very unusual special about cancer in July. So I'm not sure which week, but set your DVRs, or you can find it online, because it's really very comprehensive. They talk about Sheryl Crow and her battle. They talk about overdiagnosis, and they talk about all sorts of interesting gizmos, and go into the NCI. So it's a nice comprehensive look. And that was a nice shill for CBS, right? Thank you very much, Rick, and thank you very much.
Whoops, I didn't do that.
It's water, just water.